Good afternoon, distinguished participants. Let me first begin by thanking JSW Law School for inviting the UNFCCC Secretariat to be part of this momentous occasion. The inaugural launch of the Climate Change and Environmental Law Center, and also the launch of inaugural forum. To me, this is a big significant development because it is a big step towards enhancing the institutional arrangement to manage climate change. And this is consistent with the trend that we see with number of other countries globally, especially within developing countries. Since the adoption of Paris Agreement in 2015, more and more efforts have been put in place to enhance their institutional systems, processes, and arrangements. Wherever it was division, it has been upgraded to department. Where it was department, it has been upgraded to ministry. And that, I think, is needed from the sustainable point of view. Now, on the personal level, it is also a quite nostalgic moment for me because this is my first time in 17 years to be part of such a formal setting. So it really reminds me of those days when I was part of the government. With that, I've been asked to talk on climate change and transparency. But after listening to two comprehensive presentation, I don't think I would have much to add here. Much of the things that I had intended to capture, it was already mentioned by two earlier distinguished speakers. It is true that the provisions in Paris Agreement and even in the convention, it's ambiguous. The provisions some provisions are ambitious. That's because in the climate negotiation process, negotiators have two magic solutions. Whenever they come up with very contentious issue which they do not see a way forward, the solution that usually works is to delete. And the other one being to make it ambiguous, which we call it as constructive ambiguity that allows us to move forward. Maybe in some sense, kick the can down the line. So in my presentation, when we talk of transparency, there are different facets to it. The transparency as it relates to actions by the government, as well as transparency by non-state actors. Because over the last few years, increasing number of non-state actors have been putting forward pledges, targets, goals, and I think it is important to ensure that there is some kind of accountability. And to that end, the UN Secretary General had commissioned a high-level expert panel, and the panel presented their recommendation at the Conference of Parties in last Conference of Parties in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the UNSG then mandated the UNFCCC Secretariat to implement recommendations on accountability for non-state actor. In the interest of time, I will not go too much into the accountability of non-state actors side, but will instead focus more on what it means in terms of transparency within the UNFCCC process. I know that some of you are very familiar with the Paris Agreement, but there might be others who might be getting exposed to Paris Agreement for the first time. So if you look at the Paris Agreement, in a nutshell, we have overall overriding objectives, which I'm not going to repeat because it was already touched by two previous speakers. It has to do with the temperature goal, 2 degree, and as well as 1.5, and then the second goal being the intention to move or transition towards low emission and climate resilient pathway. And then third goal is around ensuring that there is a financial flow of finance or support in general to facilitate this transition. And then it is intended to be, these goals are intended to be achieved through so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And this nationally determined contributions are some kind of a political commitment that each government puts forward, and they are supposed to represent the best possible ambitious effort, taking into account their national circumstances. From the legal point of view, at this point in time, there is still some difference, some degree of difference in how you understand NDCs. And you can see that difference being reflected in the NDCs that are submitted and registered in the NDC registry. The NDCs from developed countries will speak to only mitigation actions, whereas NDCs from developing countries would include adaptation and finance, technology transfer, development and transfer, and capacity building support as a part of their NDCs, and that would be in addition to mitigation. And as mentioned, one layer of transparency here is communication of these NDCs, which should be guided, which is guided by a set of rules that are in place, and each, just to make sure that the information communicated is consistent across different government. And then, if you look at the accountability level, on the individual side, we have Article 13, which established enhanced transparency framework. And then the next layer of that is the implementation and compliance committee. And here, it's true that this compliance committee is, it's not a very strong one. It does not have any power in terms of enforcement. It is more of a facilitative mechanism put in place to support countries that are not able to fulfill the commitments. And then finally, we also have the so-called global stock take. It is a collective process. This global stock take is an exercise which will look at how the collective efforts, contributions reconcile with the science, what kind of gaps exist. So this process is unfolding now, and we would expect to have an outcome at the forthcoming conference of parties in Dubai. Now, when you talk of, again, Article 13, transparency, what does it really mean? in a simple terms, it's about disclosure and making sure that information disclosed is robust. And that would be achieved through a review process, which will ensure that the assumptions used, the methodologies used are robust and consistent with established literature produced by think tanks, academia, so on and so forth. And then finally, we have this process for a peer review, where countries can come together and exchange lessons learned, experiences, and engage into a facilitative discussion. So, as you can see, when we talk of disclosure, again, the extent of information that needs to be prepared and reported, it's quite exhaustive. We have to invest time and money here. So we need to ask as to why transparency matters. For a long time, we have not managed to get right narrative on this reporting disclosure side under the convention. Because whenever we ask, why are you preparing this report? The immediate answer that you get is because it is an obligation to the convention. That, to me, is not a correct way of looking at it, because there are a lot of things that you can benefit nationally from the work that goes behind. Let's say the reporting includes preparing inventory of emissions and removals. And that inventory is expected to cover whole of the country's economy. And if you have a very good quality inventory, that can give you a lot of insightful information. And I'll come to that in my subsequent slides. Similarly, when you prepare information on mitigation, there are a lot of technical work that goes behind. And the output that you get is a pathway to a low emission development, pathways for low emission development. Same on adaptation. So it generates a lot of science-based, robust data and information, which can easily feed into national planning processes. Unfortunately, in many countries, this information has been underutilized. In some cases, this nicely prepared, rich information has been sitting on some shelf collecting dust, which I think it's quite unfortunate. Then there is this capacity building element, mainly through learning by doing. You can get sense of where opportunities exist for investment. And I also think that it also provides a good platform for stakeholder engagement, because these reports are quite comprehensive, cross-cutting, that it is practically not possible for any one single agency or sector to manage it. So it provides a good platform for stakeholder engagement. Similarly, on this international side, through disclosure reporting, we are able to get a clear sense of what are the political intent, declaration of each government, and how they are progressing against how they are doing against the commitments that they have put forward. And stakeholder engagement, again, here, for the transparency framework to work, the role of non-state actors will be key, because the mechanism within the formal process is not very strong enough. And that's why we need engagement of non-state actors to shine light on these commitments, encourage, appreciate where they deserve, and also, on the other hand, point out where things are not going in the right direction. Just to illustrate a couple of points, I will not go in the details of this, but the key message from these figures, which is from IPCC report, is that there is a likelihood of keeping this 1.5 degree goal alive. However, for that to happen, the global emissions will need to peak by 2025, which is another 2-3 years, and then decline from there and reduce to about 30-45% by 2030 and reach net zero around 2050. So that's what science says. Okay, so that's what the science says. And where does our collective effort stand? This is the emission trend based on the numbers that you see in nationally determined contributions. The top shaded part is the number from the first batch of NDCs that were formally submitted in lead up to 2015 in Paris, and the dark blue represents the updated numbers from the updated NDCs. You can see a big improvement here, but we are still far short of what needs to be achieved in order to keep this 1.5 degree goal. We are 10.6% below 2010 level, whereas IPCC says that we should be around minus 30 to 45 degree. And if you overlay the NDC figures from with the what is coming out from IPCC, as mentioned by our previous speakers, we are probably on 2.2 to 2.78 degree pathway, depending on the studies that you look at. Yeah. Again, so that's where we are, and the gap is big. And again, I took this out from IPCC. Even with 1.5 degree, the impacts are we are going to feel impacts. And if you are looking at 2.67 degrees, then the impacts are going to be incomprehensible. Now, obviously, we are off track, and I hope that the global stock take that is happening now will correct the course, and that's why from the UNFCCC Secretariat side, you will hear more and more from us framing this global stock take process as course correction, because otherwise I think we are way off the chart. If you give me one more minute, I'll quickly run through 2 or 3 slides. I put together a few examples of how the value of the information that you can get from this transparency work. So this is the profile of emissions from energy sector of Bhutan. And here you can see that energy sector is the one that has grown progressively over the years until up to 2019, and it has decreased. And that decrease is not because of the policies and measures, but due to impacts of COVID. And, and if you compare that with the GDP, that you'll see similar kind of trend. The message that you can get from here is we have not yet managed to decouple our development from the emission. And for that decoupling to happen, we need to look at ways to transition to renewable source of energy. Second example, this I extracted from the national communication. It's a report prepared and submitted to the as a part of obligation to convention. That report contains a suite of mitigation options. Now, these options, if implemented, will help the country to transition towards low emission development. However, if it just remains as an option on paper, then the trend that we have seen will continue, in the emissions, it will continue to grow. Same report, if you look at adaptation, it contains a list of actions that could be implemented and that can help make climate-proof the country. So the message I'm trying to convey here is that there are a lot of work needs to happen behind the scene to prepare this work. And this information, data that you get out of this, it's really rich and powerful, and should be, to extent possible, should be used for the planning of projects, programs, policies for the country. Now, last two examples, just to illustrate the role of non-state actors. This was work done by a group, NGO, and it provides assessment of how countries are doing against their commitment. We in the UN, we are not able to undertake such kind of assessment, even if we do have technical capacity, because of the lack of mandate from member states. But non-state actors can. Okay. Yeah. Second example again, it's again work done by another non-state NGO, and that does a much more detailed assessment of country by country, and I have produced here Bhutan's assessment results. I'm not vouching for the accuracy of the research or the data here. I just put it as an illustration to show that there is a role for non-state actors, and transparency can be used as a useful tool. Yeah, so just to sum up, I want to end my presentation by quoting this management saying, "You cannot manage what you cannot measure." So I think this really sums up the transparency. Thank you.